This film, What We'll Never Know, is about a teen who falsely confessed to murder. And the reason why it's called What We'll Never Know is his confession wasn't recorded. So it's all based on police narrative. And given what we have had happening in our community, we know that that's not always the case, to be truthful. And I actually want to bring up, if that's all right with you, Camila Turner is here. She was, I guess, the main driver of this, and I really wanted to hear from her about how this all started, because I looked it up today. She emailed me 2 years ago about this case, and that's where it all began. So, round of applause. Hello, you look beautiful this evening. So tell everybody where your head was at when you contacted us.
Yes. So after, I don't want to give too much of what you're going to see, but I represented a young man, O'Shea Sims, pro bono or for free. I found out that he had confessed to a murder that happened in Memphis, in the Orange Mound area. The case went on for probably about 6 months. And then after the case was over, I felt like the story needed to be told. So I called around to just people in Memphis saying, do you know anybody who would produce a documentary about what has happened to this child? And they gave me different names, and I just really started calling around to different people in Memphis, just cold. Like, I'm a lawyer, I have a case, a child confessed to a murder, it was a false confession, I want to tell you what happened, can you help me? And so I called around to some different people. Lauren Reddy was one of those, and probably maybe a couple of weeks later, you called me back and you said, you know what, we would like to take this on as one of our projects. And so that's how how we got started.
Yeah. And we tried to get some funding for this, which I think we'll get into a little bit, but we just decided you took it on pro bono. We're going to take it on pro bono because the world needs to know this story. So
Yes.
Props to all the defense lawyers out there that fight for justice.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad you're there. We'll probably bring you up at the end too. Seriously, heroes, like the amount of time they have to dig through files and police reports and
Yeah, well, speaking of files, I know that earlier on we kind of had sort of our pre-conversation. One of the things that I really wanted us to talk about here was research of the process of getting all kinds of information and really figuring out in pre-production where to really go from there. But also sort of like, you didn't have to do freedom of information requests, but like that's another way that, especially for documentary filmmakers, that you get access to information, especially if you're making work like this. So I know Camila gave you all of the case files, and so I guess we can kind of start there. How did you sort of parse through all of that information and then decide from there?
Well, first off, I would have typically done a FOIA, Freedom of Information request. Because I'm not a journalist, when you do that as a citizen, there's oftentimes a very slow process. For some reason, it's by law a little bit faster if you're with a news organization. So she saved us a lot of time. And she checked with the defense lawyers in Memphis to make sure that that was okay and ethical to share. And then I dug through the files. I had a couple other folks look through. There was so much there. I mean, it just proves what lawyers have to do to argue a case and what they have to do to argue a case where someone has confessed to something they didn't do. It really helped shape the narrative. Obviously she did all the research ahead of time, so I was just reading the motions filed in the court. But it also contained 911 tapes of the actual murder, the call from the murder, which is chilling. You'll hear it in the doc. It contained pictures from the crime scene, which is typically something you may not get in a FOIA request. Everything was redacted, so we didn't have, the information that it was redacted accordingly. And we even chose to redact some more. So in the film, you'll see we took out all phone numbers and things like that. That really helped share helped us see what different pieces of the story, but it also confused me for a little while because there was so much there that it was hard to decide if this was going to be a murder mystery or if this was going to be a story about changing the law. Because you can go easily down that rabbit hole and try to be the detective, and I am not a trained detective. So you'll see we chose the avenue of raising awareness about the law, or lack thereof.
I think also something that is really interesting, and you will also see as you watch the film, is that choice to really focus more so on the law and like very much humanize that experience. So I'm also curious, as you all were shaping in pre-production and sort of thinking about sort of your guiding focus with the film. We talked a bit about like you all had a thesis statement or a thesis that you sort of used to guide the film. So I'm curious, as you were, working in that pre-production phase and really working with your team in collaboration, because you very luckily had like your team to really work with, if you want to speak to sort of collaborating with them, but also how you all kind of came to this thesis really focused on the law.
Yeah, it's, I was actually, the slide I was going to share with you, I had a misspelling on our whiteboard for like 7 months, and I didn't know it was misspelled until today. But I'm a terrible speller. What we did, we had a summer intern who was working with us, who's the same age as O'Shea, the teen in this story. And she was going through her archives, and she found this folder called O'Shea Sims documentary. We didn't know exactly what it should be. She read through all of it, and she said, "What are you doing with this?" And I said, "Oh, it's actually, we're trying to decide what to do with it. There's a lot there." And she said, "Well, he's the same age as me." So it kind of reignited and gave us a face of somebody right in front of us who could have been impacted by this personally. And so we all sat down and literally took Post-it notes and wrote out different things that we thought would be good to include in the doc. The actual case, the 911 calls, who we might want to hear from, what kind of character building we might want to do for O'Shea. And then we put them all on a whiteboard and moved them around. That's the best part. It's real old-fashioned. I'm sure there's like some program out there that does this for you, but I love like physically moving it. So we moved it along, and we started to realize we can't get into the nitty-gritty of the specifics of what every report said. And so as a team, we wrote on the top of the whiteboard, thesis, "No child should be questioned without a lawyer present," and circled it and circled it. And so every time we had a debate about what to include, what to take out, what details were important, what was too much, we pointed to the thesis and said, does it carry people to that, or does it distract people from that? So it's how we ended up cutting a lot. And I'm sure John, who's not able to be here, who helped edit the film at times, was very unhappy with me saying, chop that detail. That's not important. That's going to distract people. But having that up on a whiteboard for us to look at every day really reminded us why we were doing the film and what the story should be about.
Yeah, I think moving into sort of the production kind of phase of this, so you've done all of the research, you kind of have a baseline for what's your guiding force in making the film. So I'm curious now, like in terms of thinking about who to talk to. Of course, you have the lawyers to talk to. You have other people, and the people around O'Shea that you could talk to. So sort of, how did you all decide who you felt would help really like bolster and shape out O'Shea as a person? And then also kind of, how did you, like as a documentarian or just as a filmmaker, think about the care of how you were going to care for those people while you were talking to them?
Absolutely. I think one of my most important values in telling a story through documentary is remembering the dignity of the folks and knowing that this is their lived story, and that I'm just been, gifted the opportunity to help tell it. But we really need to honor that. So we tried really hard to find people who could build up who O'Shea was. It actually ended up being a teacher of his that was in jail, that was like his jail teacher, because a lot of his former educators who originally contacted the lawyers had moved on to other jobs and lived in other states. So we struggled to find folks who could help build that up. We also interviewed his mother, and you will not see that in the film, which we can talk more about when we talk about post. But we went to interview her with Camila. She knew her and had a relationship, and it became very clear in the middle of the interview that we weren't going to be using it. She had some mental health issues and didn't really fully understand what we were doing there. And we knew that meant that it wasn't a good idea for us to include it for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, the ethics behind someone understanding what you're doing. But also because we didn't think that it helped advance the ultimate goal, and it really just would distract people or give people an excuse to say, oh, well, that was just his situation. So we left that out, and that's a big piece that's missing from this. The other side of that is that a lot of these interviews were discovery interviews that we ended up using and never went back and got, like, because we were just like, let's interview them and see what they say. And then they said wonderful things, and we had to include those. So we interviewed Camila 4 times and Janika, the other lawyer, twice, just to fill in some of the gaps and have them walk us through some of the motions they filed. But it was a challenge to visually tell this story and determine who to talk to about specific things so that it was still cohesive enough for the audience to walk away wanting change.
Yeah, I actually was going to kind of ask next about sort of the visual thinking of the film. We talked a little bit earlier about how because a lot of these interviews were sort of discovery, and then you really realize that what they said really needed to be seen. So I guess this is sort of moving a little bit into post, but we'll come back to it. But I guess also like, you're thinking a lot about the setup of things, and with documentary especially, you can't predict what people are going to say, how they're going to feel. So can you also kind of give some context into that? And also, Lauren has a background as a journalist, and so I think it would also be helpful for the filmmakers here to hear about how that maybe benefited you a little bit, especially in those interview scenes, and working with people. Sort of how do you kind of approach that as well?
Yeah, I like to call myself a recovering journalist. Can't really you can take me out of the newsroom, but I still think and see the world that way. And so I see stories everywhere. And in this case, what was really important to me was to be truthful, but to include details that would speak to both sides. And the reason why I say both sides is lawmakers are who we needed to change this law. And that means we're changing folks' minds, hearts, perspectives. And so there were pieces of the story that anyone can relate to, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum, beliefs, values, those kinds of things. So as we move forward with the editing process, it was important to me, and again, this is like part of my journalism background, is like to think about the other side, even though by the end I was completely biased. But in the process of planning, what's the other side? Who do we also need to attempt to reach out to, which would have been our former DA and the police department. And so those pieces of the story were important to at least attempt, but mostly to consider that I wanted both sides of the aisle to come together in this story and make sure that it resonated no matter where you fell in the spectrum. I think that's hard in documentaries because we're all biased. Like, every documentary ever made is biased, even if they attempt to tell the other side, or you just come at it from a biased place. But we had a lot of conversations about, are we doing this story enough justice, pun intended, if we don't at least attempt to try and get the other side. It's funny because the other side didn't have anything really to say, so that should say enough, right?
Yeah, it's a little ominous sound. I think another thing that is interesting visually is something that you made very clear, even in our festival Q&A, but also earlier when we talked about this, is sort of trying to combat the kind of sensational way that often things involving criminal justice or just crime in general can be covered, and also sort of the framing that it has, especially when it involves people who are from marginalized backgrounds. So I guess that would also, I think, be really helpful for you to talk about a little bit more when you all were sort of talking about the visual look, also practically, because there are a lot of like documents in this. So thinking a little bit about how you decided to represent that, but also sort of moving away from this like true crime way of approaching it.
And there's like one scene that you're going to be like, ooh, this feels a little true crimey. It's about the crime scene, so it seemed appropriate. But the rest of the film, we shot the photo or the video of all the documents thanks to lens rental. We rented some lenses, some prime lenses, to get some really sharp focus on words, specific words and documents. And then we have like this little stick light that changes colors. So we made it blue, then we made it red, and like made it look dramatic, I think. I mean, we tried. Because how do you make documents exciting and interesting in real? And like, we wanted to showcase there's all these documents. So that was a piece of it. And then again, John Quinn, who's not here, had this vision. We had very little video, and you'll understand why when you watch it, why we had very little video. We had this one shot of him playing in the drumline that we got off YouTube. And it was not very long, and we couldn't find much more of him drumming. So John had the idea to get a projector and project it onto our brick wall in our studio. He really wanted to do it with like a fog machine. And this is an example of like the difference between, I'm like, let's just do it. And John's like, we got to find the right light bulb that like does the right light for the projector so it looks good. And I was like, I have a fog machine from my Halloween decorations in 2020, because everybody did that. I have fog juice. My friend has a projector. Let's just try it. So we went in the studio and turned on the fog machine and turned on the projector. And it wasn't exactly, I think, what John envisioned, but it took care of it. And it showed, and you'll see in the doc, it's so DIY, but it's also what it took to get it done. I think that was kind of the mentality here, is it's not perfect, but it's an important story. And had we spent more time working on it to make it perfect, it wouldn't be out in the world today, and people wouldn't know what this issue is really about. So we kind of had to get out of our own head, which is anybody who identifies as an artist in the audience. So you get really in your head, right? And you're like, it's got to be perfect, and it's got to be shot the same, and people are going to critique it. And I was just saying, let's just do it. Let's just see what happens. It might look terrible. And I don't think it did. And so that was the mentality. Let's get it done. Let's get it out to audiences. And of course, every time I watch it, I think of ways we could fix it or make it better, which I think is probably how everyone feels.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to ask one more question sort of about funding before we show the film. But I know that you were just saying, like, you ended up just making it. But I know that you talked a little bit about how you did look for funding and did try that first. So if you want to speak to that a little bit also, because I know that's often, especially for documentaries, the access to funding is really a process. I mean, the funding for everybody, but especially working in doc. So yeah.
Well, I think I have to speak to the privilege that exists in this moment, because I have a video production company, which means my company has all the gear, has the staff that willingly wanted to participate. They weren't forced to. Everybody was very passionate about this. So it kind of came with a bunch of things that are a little bit different than if you're just starting and have an idea. But with that in mind, we applied for 2 grants. We were rejected both times. But we'd already said, yes, we're going to do it regardless. And so we just sort of adopted this mentality that I think is very indie. And Kyle spoke to it. Small crew, get it done with what you have. I'm just a huge fan of using what you have. And that's what I tell people when I try to inspire folks to tell their story, is use what you have. If that's your cell phone, use that. And so that's what we decided to do. We're going to use everything we have at our disposal to make this happen. And even if we don't get the funding, hopefully we get the end goal. And I think that really helped. I would encourage anyone in the audience who's got an idea, but feels like they need funding to make the idea happen, to just start. It's not going to be perfect. This will be proof of that, but just starting it and going down the path of doing the best with what you have is better than it staying in your head and the world not hearing about it. So that's my 2 cents about just doing it. And that comes from journalism. I used to have to produce a story every day on the news by 5 o'clock. So done is better than perfect is something that I've always adopted. And that's what I would say about funding.
Thank you so much for that, Lindy. And Todd, I think it is really interesting hearing like how much journalism and that experience can really sort of impact the way that you look at things. So I appreciate you like really being honest about that aspect of it.